The cold that settles over Greenwich, Connecticut in November is not the kind that simply chills the air. It is the kind that presses down on the chest, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, and impossibly heavy. It moves through the bare branches of the old elm trees lining Pemberton Drive and finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed patch of skin, every unguarded corner of your heart. On mornings like this one, the sky over the Long Island Sound goes the color of old pewter and stays that way all day, neither brightening nor darkening, just holding its grayness with the commitment of something that has made a decision and intends to keep it. Sadie Wyatt had lived on Pemberton Drive for her entire life. She knew the way the morning light hit the limestone facade of the house at exactly 7:45 in winter, a brief orange wash that lasted perhaps 4 minutes before the cloud cover absorbed it. She knew the particular creak of the third porch step, the one her father had always meant to fix but never did, attributing the delay each time to a different reason, as if the step itself kept generating new excuses on his behalf. She knew the weight of the front door's solid mahogany 8 feet tall, with a brass handle worn smooth from decades of use. She had touched that handle 10,000 times. Coming home from school, coming home from the summer marine biology program she had attended 3 years running in Woods Hole, coming home from the hospital the morning her father finally let her drive alone. For the first time, both of them pretending he had not sat awake until she texted him from the driveway. On the morning of November the 14th, she touched it for the last time. She did not go inside. The door did not open for her. She stood on the broad stone porch of the $18 million estate that had been her home for 19 years, holding a black heavy-duty trash bag in both hands. Inside the bag were 2 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, a worn gray hoodie with a fraying drawstring, her phone charger, a paperback novel with a broken spine she had been meaning to finish for 6 weeks, in a green metal fishing tackle box that had once belonged to her father. It was the only thing she had managed to grab from his study before the security guard, a man named Dwight, who had been with the household for 11 years and who had watched her grow from a child who left fingerprints on every glass surface to a young woman who fixed her own car brakes in the driveway, placed a firm and apologetic hand on her elbow and guided her toward the door. Dwight would not look at her. Nobody would. On the other side of the glass panels flanking the front door stood Diana Crane Wyatt. She was wearing a cream cashmere wrap, the kind that costs more than a month's rent. In most American cities, her dark hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had made the decision to look composed before getting out of bed. Her expression was arranged in the particular stillness of people who have rehearsed difficult moments until all the spontaneous feeling has been removed and only the performance of calm remains. Beside her stood her son, Prescott Crane, 22 years old, freshly graduated from a university whose name alone opened every door worth opening in this country. He was holding a ceramic mug of coffee and wearing a look that occupied the territory between contempt and discomfort, as if he found the situation distasteful, but had decided that distaste was preferable to examining it too closely. Diana's voice came through the narrow gap at the edge of the door, measured and unhurried. "You are 19 years old, Sadie, legally an adult. The estate belongs to me now, and that has been established through proper legal channels. If you return to this property without a specific invitation from me, I will have you removed by the police. I hope you understand that this is not personal." Then the door closed. The deadbolt turned. The sound of it, that single clean mechanical click, traveled up through the stone porch and into the soles of Sadie's feet, and lodged somewhere deep in her chest, where it would remain for a very long time, surfacing at odd moments, like a stone worked loose from riverbed mud. She walked down the long, curving driveway. The gravel crunched beneath her sneakers, with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud in the still morning air. The elm trees stood on either side like witnesses who had decided collectively and without discussion not to testify. The iron gate at the end of the drive swung open on its automatic hinges as she approached the same way it always had, responding to the sensor she had triggered 10,000 times before, and then swung shut behind her with a soft, decisive finality that the automatic mechanism could not have intended but achieved nonetheless. Sadie Wyatt stood on the sidewalk of Pemberton Drive with a trash bag of damp clothes, a green tackle box, and nothing else in the world that was hers. She stood there for a long time. The wind moved through the elm branches. A car passed without slowing. Down the street, a dog barked twice and then was quiet. Then she walked to her car. The 2009 Honda Civic was parked 2 blocks away on a side street because Diana had decided 3 weeks prior, in the first days after Edward Wyatt's funeral, that the driveway was not available for Sadie's use. The car was old in the specific way of things that have been maintained with attention rather than money. The back left wheel well had a rust spot the size of a dinner plate that Sadie had treated with rust converter and primer the previous spring and fully intended to paint over when the weather cooperated. The passenger side mirror was held in place with electrical tape applied in a tight, careful wrap that had held for 8 months. Edward had offered to buy her a new car on her 18th birthday, a generous offer made in the casual way of a man for whom the gesture would have cost nothing. And Sadie had told him she liked this one, that it had character, that she knew exactly what it was going to do when she turned the key. He had laughed at that low and warm a sound that came from somewhere deeper than simple amusement and had told her she sounded like him. She had told him she would take that as a compliment. He had said she should. She put the trash bag in the trunk. She set the tackle box carefully on the passenger seat as if it were something that could be damaged. She sat behind the wheel for a while without starting the engine, watching leaves skitter across the asphalt in the November wind, watching the street do nothing in particular, watching the world continue its ordinary business with complete indifference to the fact that hers had just ended. Then she drove away. She had nowhere to go. This is the part of the story that does not get told when the ending is already known, the part that gets compressed or skipped entirely because it resists narrative shape. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were grinding and cold and profoundly ordinary in their misery, the misery of logistics and exposure, and the steady depletion of small resources. Sadie slept in the Civic, moving it every few hours to avoid drawing attention from parking enforcement. She developed a rotation of locations, the back corner of a Walmart lot that turned a blind eye to overnight vehicles, the far end of a church parking lot on weeknights. When no events were scheduled, the shoulder of a quiet residential street in a neighborhood where she calculated no one would call anything in. She found a 24-hour gym 3 miles from Pemberton Drive and paid the monthly membership fee with the last money in her debit account to have access to a shower and bathroom with reliable lighting and hot water. She ate peanut butter from a jar with a plastic spoon, crackers from a sleeve she kept in the glove compartment beside the registration, and the occasional hot meal from a diner 2 miles off the interstate where a waitress named Birdie always refilled her coffee without being asked and pretended not to notice that Sadie occupied the same corner booth for 3 hours at a time, nursing a single cup. The first week she made calls. She called her father's college roommate, a man named Porter Ashby, who had always been the kind of warm and expansive presence at family gatherings that made you feel in the moment that the world contained more goodwill than it actually did. The call went to voicemail. She left a message that she tried to make sound less desperate than it was. He did not call back. She called her godmother, a woman named Claudette Finch, who lived in a brownstone in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood, and who had sent Sadie a pearl necklace for her 16th birthday with a card that said, "Pearls are for women who know their own worth." Claudette answered. She listened for approximately 40 seconds. She said she was very sorry for the situation, but that she could not become involved in what was clearly a legal matter, and that Sadie should consult with an attorney. And then she ended the call with a gentleness that was somehow worse than abruptness would have been. The second week, Sadie stopped calling people. She sat instead in the parking lot of a grocery store off Interstate 95, under a sodium lamp that buzzed and flickered in the cold, with the irregular rhythm of something failing slowly, and she thought about her father. Not about the money, not about the house, or the company, or any of the material weight of what had been taken from her. She thought about Saturday mornings. She thought about the particular smell of engine oil and black coffee in early lake water. She thought about this quality of silence that can exist between two people who are comfortable enough with each other to not fill it. Edward Wyatt had built his logistics software company Wyatt Group from a two-room office above a dry cleaner on Asylum Avenue in Hartford, Connecticut, when he was 26 years old, with a business plan, a used server rack, and a stubbornness that the people who knew him early described as either inspiring or exhausting, depending on what he happened to be asking of them at the time. He had grown it over 23 years into a company that moved critical supply chain data for some of the largest retail and pharmaceutical distribution networks in the country. A company whose operational software touched more commerce than most people would ever know. He was worth, by the time he died, an amount of money that had enough digits to feel abstract, like a figure from a physics problem, rather than a number belonging to a person who burned toast on Sunday mornings and kept a collection of antique fishing reels he never actually used. But the man she knew was not the man in the business profiles. The man she knew kept those antique fly fishing reels on a dedicated shelf in his study, each one more elaborate and impractical than the last. A hardy featherweight he had found at an estate sale in Vermont, a Vom Hof salmon reel from the 1890s he had sourced through a specialist dealer in Scotland, a Bogdan he had saved for over 2 years to afford, and he spent more time examining them and explaining their mechanisms to anyone who would listen than he ever spent actually fishing. He drove a 12-year-old Ford pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it because, as he said, he knew exactly what that truck was going to do when he turned the key, and there was a specific value in that kind of predictability that no amount of new car features could replicate. He had coached Sadie's youth soccer team for 2 seasons when she was 9 and 10, despite knowing nothing about the sport at the outset, and never across either season successfully learning the offside rule, though he made a genuine effort each time it was called. He read history, not the popular variety with its clean narratives and accessible language, but the dense academic kind, the kind with footnotes longer than the chapters themselves. And he would leave these books open on the kitchen counter with certain passages underlined in soft pencil because he wanted Sadie to encounter them accidentally, to read something important without having been told to. He called her his compass, not because she always pointed in the right direction, he was always careful to specify, but because she never lost her orientation. Because even when she was wrong, she knew where she was standing. She remained located even in unfamiliar territory. That was the quality he meant, and the distinction mattered to him. He had started using that word when she was 11 years old, after she navigated the two of them back to the boat launch on Lake Candlewood, using nothing but a topographic map and her reading of the sun's position, after he had managed to get them genuinely turned around in the reeds on the eastern shore during what was supposed to be a straightforward afternoon of paddling. He had looked at her across the canoe in the moment she called the correct bearing, and his expression had been one of unguarded, uncomplicated pride, the kind adults rarely allow themselves in front of children because they worry it will produce arrogance. He had said quietly, almost to himself, that she was his compass. She had rolled her eyes with the practiced efficiency of 11-year-olds everywhere. But she had carried that word with her every day since, pressing it into service in the difficult moments the way you press your thumb against a bruise to confirm it is real. She pressed it into service now in the flickering amber light of a grocery store parking lot, 3 weeks and 2 days after they had lowered her father's casket into the November ground of the Putnam Cemetery on Round Hill Road. Edward Wyatt had died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in early September. He was 58 years old. He had been managing a diagnosed structural weakness in his heart for 3 years, a condition requiring medication and careful monitoring, and the gradual adoption of lifestyle adjustments he had approached with the pragmatic compliance of someone who understood what the alternative was. His cardiologist described his management of the condition as good, not perfect, but good, the realistic, achievable standard for a man running a company and trying to live a full life. The death was called unexpected, which is what physicians say when all the documented indicators pointed elsewhere, and the body made a different decision. Sadie had been at the county library on Putnam Avenue working through a reading list she had assembled for herself after deferring her college enrollment when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She answered it with a vague physical unease she could not have articulated. The voice on the other end belonged to a hospitalist at Greenwich Hospital who spoke in the practiced cadences of someone who has learned that clarity delivered gently is more humane than vagueness dressed as kindness. She drove to the hospital. She sat in a room with pale green walls and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard and a small tree that still had most of its leaves. A chaplain came to sit with her, a quiet man of perhaps 60, who did not attempt to fill the silence with reassurances and did not try to guide her toward any particular emotional response, and she was grateful for both absences. Diana arrived 40 minutes later with Prescott. Both of them were composed in ways that Sadie, operating in the immediate fog of shock, did not have the cognitive resources to examine. The funeral was held on a Saturday. The sky was the same pewter color it had been on the morning she left Pemberton Drive 2 months later, as if November in Greenwich recognized only one shade of appropriate. Several hundred people came, former colleagues and current colleagues and competitors who had respected Edward enough to make the drive. Local officials who had known him through philanthropic work. People who had worked for him in the company's early years and who had stories that began with, and then he said, or, and this is the thing about Edward. Sadie stood beside the casket in a black dress that still had the size sticker inside the collar because she had bought it that morning and removed the tags but missed the sticker, and she shook hands and accepted condolences and said thank you until the words became purely mechanical. A sequence of mouth movements her body performed while the rest of her stood in a canoe on a Connecticut lake, watching light move across flat water. 3 days after the funeral, Aldrich Hollis called to schedule the reading of the will. Aldrich Hollis had been the Wyatt family's attorney for 18 years. He had a corner office in downtown Greenwich with a harbor view, the kind of office that communicates without stating anything directly, that the person inside it has been trusted with important things by important people for a long time. He had attended Edward's 50th birthday dinner. He had sent Sadie a handwritten note when she graduated from high school, 3 lines on heavy cream paper in a precise script that matched his public persona perfectly. He wore pocket squares that coordinated without matching. He spoke with the measured, considered authority of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades being the most reliably correct person in any room he entered, and Sadie had always found him reassuring in the way that solid, well-built things are reassuring: a stone wall, a cast-iron bridge, something that has stood long enough that its standing has become its primary credential. She sat across from him in his conference room. Diana and Prescott were to her left. Diana's personal attorney beside them, several associate attorneys arranged along the walls. The room smelled of leather and old wood, and the faint petroleum undertone of new carpet recently installed. Aldrich Hollis had not looked at her since she arrived. He kept his eyes on the legal document resting on the table in front of him, and when he began to speak, his voice had the quality of a man reading coordinates aloud, precise and drained of any freight beyond the informational. He had a will to present, a revised will, signed and notarized, dated 3 weeks before Edward Wyatt's death. The document left the estate, the company, all liquid assets, the investment portfolios, the real estate holdings, and the offshore accounts to Diana Crane Wyatt in their entirety. The language was comprehensive in the way that legal language is comprehensive when it has been written by someone who has thought carefully about what might be challenged and has worked to foreclose those challenges in advance. Sadie received a single disbursement, $10,000 to be released upon the completion of probate proceedings. Aldrich Hollis finished reading. He set the document down. He folded his hands on the table with the deliberate care of a man who has decided in advance exactly what his hands will be doing during this particular moment. He still had not looked at her. The room was very quiet. Outside the harbor window, a boat moved slowly across the gray water. Sadie looked at the document. She looked at Diana, who was focused on a point on the wall slightly above Sadie's head, with the expression of someone who is waiting for something to be over. She looked at Prescott, who was studying his thumbnail with a concentration it did not merit. She looked at Aldrich Hollis's folded hands. She said one thing. She said, "My father would not have written that." No one responded. The associate attorneys made small rustling sounds with their papers. Aldrich Hollis cleared his throat softly and began explaining the probate timeline. Diana's attorney leaned close to Diana and said something that produced a single small nod. Sadie stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked through the conference room and through the lobby and out the glass door into the cold November air. She sat in her car for nearly an hour before she could make herself drive. She spent 2 days attempting to find an attorney who would take her case. The first three declined after reviewing what she could tell them about the will. The fourth agreed to a consultation and called back the following morning to cancel without explanation. The fifth, a woman who had been practicing estate law in Stamford for 30 years and who met with Sadie in an office that smelled of old coffee, told her with what appeared to be genuine regret that without concrete evidence of fraud or undue influence, the will would be nearly impossible to contest through standard channels. A notarized witnessed revision superseded prior wills in all but exceptional circumstances. Her best option, the attorney said carefully, was to accept the disbursement when probate cleared and focus on the future. The $10,000 never came. Diana's attorney cited ongoing complications in the probate process. Weeks passed. The money remained locked inside procedural language that functioned in practice as a wall. She was 19 years old. She was sleeping in a Honda Civic in the parking lot of a grocery store in Greenwich, Connecticut. Her father was dead, and everything he had spent a lifetime building was in the hands of a woman who had said, "This is not personal," before closing a mahogany door on her stepdaughter, standing in the rain. And the man who had been the family's most trusted advisor for 18 years had sat 3 feet away from Sadie in a conference room and read a document that contradicted everything she had known about her father's intentions and had not once, not for a single moment, met her eyes. She came back to that. The eyes, the specific quality of Aldrich Hollis's avoidance, the way it was not absent-mindedness or shyness, but something chosen, something maintained with the same deliberateness as his folded hands and his measured voice. People who are delivering difficult news involuntarily look at the person receiving it. The instinct is almost impossible to override completely. Aldrich Hollis had overridden it completely. She thought about this at 3 in the morning with the Civic windows frosted over from her breath, her hands pulled inside her sleeves, the engine off to save gas. It was the third week of November when she finally opened the tackle box. She had been staring at it for days without touching it. It sat on the passenger seat, and she drove around it and parked and slept and woke and drove again, with the box always in her peripheral vision, a green metal shape that smelled faintly of machine oil and old lake water, and the specific combination of those two things that her brain processed not as smell, but as presence, as her father occupying the passenger seat in the only form still available to him. She had grabbed it on instinct when Dwight walked her toward the door, reaching for it from the desk, where it sat in a spot it did not normally occupy. Her father kept his fishing gear in the garage. The tackle box had no business being on his study desk. She had taken it anyway, the way you reach for the most familiar thing when everything else is collapsing. The box was an old Plano model, the kind sold in sporting goods stores for 40 years, and recognizable to anyone who had ever stood in the fishing aisle of a rural hardware store. The green paint was worn to bare metal along all the edges. There was a faded sticker on the near side from a bait shop in central Vermont that they had visited when Sadie was 14, a trip she remembered primarily for the fog on the water at 5 in the morning and the way her father had handed her tea from a thermos and then said nothing for 20 minutes because the morning asked for silence, and he knew how to read a morning. She was sitting under the amber lot lamp engine, idling for warmth heater on low to save fuel when she finally unlatched the lid. The smell hit her before anything else. Old metal and dried rubber, and the ghost of lake water, and the oil you put on reels to keep the mechanism smooth, and the combination arrived not as scent, but as sensation, physical and specific, a pressure behind the sternum that she had to breathe through. She pressed her lips together and waited until the moment subsided. Inside the box were the expected things. The compartmented tray with its small labeled envelopes of dry flies, its leaders and tippets wound carefully, 2 rubber-handled nippers, an old tin of fly floatant with a dented lid, and one of his antique reels, the hardy featherweight from Vermont, small and precisely made and impractical for any actual fishing she would ever do, which was exactly why he had loved it. She ran her fingers along the objects without intent, touching the familiar shapes, locating herself in something that had been his. Then her fingertip caught an edge. She went still. She pressed the corner of the tray insert. It shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but it moved in a way that the bottom of a solid metal box does not move. She pressed the opposite corner. That one held. Back to the first corner, then adjacent corners working around until she understood the geometry of it. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie for the folding knife she had been carrying since her second night sleeping in the car and worked the thin blade carefully along the edge of the tray. The false bottom gave way with a soft, depressurized click, like a seal breaking for the first time on something that had been carefully closed. She looked at what was underneath. Two things: a small drawstring pouch in dark green velvet, and a folded piece of yellow legal paper folded twice unevenly, the fold of someone working quickly. She picked up the paper. Her hands were steady. She would think about that afterward, the stillness of her hands in that moment, the way the body sometimes achieves a calm in extreme circumstances that the mind cannot replicate. The handwriting was her father's. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice instantly and completely. But the letter shapes were different from his usual hand, which was deliberate and slightly architectural, each letter properly formed. This was compressed, the letters pushing against each other, the pen having pressed harder than normal on certain words so that they were slightly raised tactile, as if the emphasis had been physical as much as grammatical. She read it twice without moving any other part of her body. Sadie. If you are reading this, I did not get it done in time. Do not trust Aldrich Hollis. He has been working with Diana for longer than you know. They have been organizing things against me for months, and my medication makes my thinking foggy in ways I cannot fully explain or fight against. I have signed documents I should not have signed. I understand that now. I am trying to correct it, but I do not have the time I thought I had. I could not put anything in your name on paper. She would have found it. The attorney she controls would have found it. Go to First National Bank in downtown Greenwich. Safe deposit box 402. Use the key that is in the pouch. I put your name on the access list 3 years ago and never told anyone. There is something in that box that matters very much. I love you, Sadie. I am sorry for the difficulty I am putting you through. You are the best thing in my life, and knowing that you might read this in hard circumstances is the thing that has kept me moving when I wanted to stop. You are my compass. Find your way. Your father. She read it a third time. Then she set it down on the seat with the careful deliberateness you use with things that are simultaneously fragile and enormous. And she opened the velvet pouch and turned it over her palm. A key. Small, precisely cut, with the slightly industrial quality of keys made for mechanisms rather than for locks you can buy at a hardware store. No label, no identifying marks. Just the key itself, solid and cool in her palm. She closed her fingers around it. She sat with the engine idling and the heater moving warm air in circuits around the cold car. And she looked at the yellow paper on the seat and the velvet pouch on the dashboard and the green tackle box with its false bottom. And she thought about everything. She thought she had understood about the past 3 months and whether any of it looked different now. She thought about the fog her father described, the medication that made his thinking unclear. He had mentioned this to her obliquely over the previous year. He had said sometimes he felt slightly removed from himself, as if managing his own life from a comfortable distance rather than from inside it. She had attributed this to the medication's documented side effects and to the specific fatigue of running a large company in his late 50s. She had noticed it in him, the occasional hesitation, the moments when he lost the thread of a conversation and recovered it slowly, shaking his head in a particular way, as if dislodging something. She had thought it was the medication. She had thought it was age and stress and the ordinary cost of an extraordinary life. She had not thought it was anything else. She pressed the key against her palm until she could feel its outline clearly. Then she looked up the address of First National Bank on her phone. She did not sleep. At 7:45 in the morning, still dark in November, she drove to the bank. She looked like what she was, a young woman who had been sleeping in a car for 3 weeks, who had access to a gym shower, but not to adequate rest or consistent nutrition, whose clothes had been worn too many consecutive days despite her best efforts. There is a quality to sustained deprivation that presents itself regardless of hygiene, a specific kind of tiredness that lives behind the eyes and in the set of the shoulders. First National Bank on Greenwich Avenue had a lobby that communicated institutional solidity through every design choice. Dark wood paneling, diffused lighting that was warm without being warm, carpeting that absorbed sound, a reception desk staffed by a woman in a dark blazer who processed the appearance of the person approaching her desk without making the processing visible. A junior manager near the entrance who looked up when Sadie came through the door and looked at her for a moment before looking back at whatever he was doing, the look of a person who has formed a quick preliminary conclusion and is filing it. Sadie walked directly to the manager and told him she needed access to safe deposit box 402. She showed him her driver's license. She showed him the key from the velvet pouch. He looked at the license and then at the key and then at his computer screen. She watched his expression move from practiced neutrality through a brief recalibration when the screen confirmed what the key suggested, that her name was on the authorized access list, and then back to professional neutrality, the reinstated version. He made no comment. He led her through a security door down a corridor lined on one side with the small metal doors of individual deposit boxes and into a private viewing room at the end. One small table, two chairs. The room smelled faintly of metal and recycled air. Box 402 was approximately 12 inches wide by 24 inches long, deeper than it looked from the front. He set it on the table, told her the call button on the wall would summon him when she was finished, and left, pulling the door closed with the soft click of institutional privacy. She stood over the box for a moment. Then she lifted the lid. No money, no gold or jewelry or anything that could be converted directly to survival. There was a single manila folder thick with documents. Clipped to the outside of the folder was a small index card in her father's compressed, urgent hand. Everything you need is in here, and everything that matters is where I always told you to look. Look up Sadie. She set the card on the table and opened the folder. The top document was a property deed. She read it carefully, working through the legal description. The property was registered to a limited liability company she had never heard of, Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. Clipped to the deed was a notarized operating agreement, several pages thick, that named Sadie Christine Wyatt as the sole member and owner of Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. The notarization was dated 14 months before her father's death. He had not done this in the panicked last weeks. He had done it more than a year before he died, which meant he had been thinking about contingencies she could not have known he feared for a very long time, which meant the fear itself had existed for a very long time. The property was located in Jackson County, Wisconsin. The nearest municipality listed in the legal description was a city called Black River Falls. She had never heard her father mention Black River Falls. She could not recall Wisconsin appearing in any conversation she had ever had with him in 19 years. He was thoroughly a New England man, formed by the particular geography of Connecticut winters and Massachusetts summers, and the dense specific culture of the northeastern Atlantic coast. Wisconsin existed in her understanding of him the way distant planets exist in daily life, technically real but practically irrelevant. Behind the deed and the LLC documents was one more item: a plain brass key with a piece of masking tape wrapped around the bow. Written on the tape in the same compressed hand as the tackle box letter were two words: front door. Sadie sat down in one of the chairs at the small table. She held the brass key in her left hand and the bank key in her right, and looked at the documents spread across the table in front of her. This architecture of anticipation and dread that her father had constructed over 14 months of living with whatever he had known. He had been afraid. That was what the document said beneath the legal language. He had been afraid, and he had not told her. And the thing he had done instead of telling her was build a path she could follow after he was gone, because he trusted that she would follow it. Because she was his compass, and compasses are useful precisely in the absence of the person who gave them to you. She thought about the money she had left. $60 roughly in the account Diana's legal team had not been able to reach because it predated the marriage by 3 years. The Civic had just under half a tank of gas. She had crackers and most of a jar of peanut butter. She gathered the documents. She left the folder in the box and pressed the call button. The manager returned and led her back through the corridor. She thanked him at the lobby. He nodded the careful nod of someone who has learned not to comment on things that are not his business, and watched her walk out into the November morning. Outside, the air was sharp and bright, the wind having scoured the clouds away overnight. The sun was low and precise. She walked back to the Civic and stood beside the passenger door for a moment, looking at the green tackle box on the seat, at the letter folded on top of it, at the velvet pouch on the dashboard with its drawstring open. She reached into the glove compartment past the crackers and the registration and the worn road atlas her father had given her when she first got the car, a paper atlas in an era of GPS, because he said knowing how to read a paper map was a survival skill. She found what she was looking for. A list of pawn shops in the area printed 2 weeks earlier when she had first considered selling the Hardy featherweight and had not been able to bring herself to do it. She drove to the nearest one. The man behind the counter was elderly and precise in the manner of people who have spent their working lives handling small mechanical objects and have developed the particular patience and attentiveness that such objects require. He examined the reel with genuine interest, turning it over carefully, checking the drag mechanism, examining the finish on the spool. He offered $85. She accepted without negotiating. He wrapped it in tissue paper and set it on the shelf behind him with a care that she recognized as the care of someone who understood the value of what they were receiving and intended to honor it. She did not allow herself to watch him set it down. She filled the tank completely. She bought 2 loaves of bread and a third jar of peanut butter and a box of protein bars at a gas station and added them to the supplies in the back seat. She loaded the GPS coordinates for Black River Falls, Wisconsin into her phone. The route said 5 hours and 42 minutes. She thought about something her father said when a planned route presented too many unknowns. He would trace the first segment with his finger and say, "We don't need to know everything about where we're going. We only need enough to make the first turn." She made the first turn. She drove north out of Greenwich, found the interstate, and left Connecticut behind. The landscape changed over the next several hours in the way landscapes change when you drive through the seam between regions, the dense northeastern grid dissolving gradually into the wider open geometry of the Midwest, the highway cutting through fields that had finished their season and gone brown, and still the sky expanding as the terrain flattened. She drove in silence after the radio lost its last clear signal somewhere in central New York. The green tackle box sat on the passenger seat. The index card was in the pocket of her hoodie. The brass key was looped on a length of lanyard from the glove compartment and hung around her wrist. She stopped once for gas and coffee in a station outside Erie, Pennsylvania, and stood at the pump in the cold wind, watching the numbers turn, her mind doing what it does when the body is occupied and the conscious attention is released, which is to run back over everything, rearranging the pieces, looking for the shape underneath. She crossed into Wisconsin in the early evening. The light was going flat, the sky lowering toward dusk, the fields giving way to forest at the edge of the county roads that led off the interstate. Pine and birch and oak in the failing light standing close to the road, with the solidity of things that have been standing for a long time and have no particular awareness of anything passing on the road beside them. The GPS took her off the interstate onto a state highway that gradually narrowed. The state highway became a county road. The county road became gravel. The gravel became a track barely wide enough for the Civic branches from the encroaching oaks reaching in from both sides, so that she was driving through a living tunnel, the headlights illuminating only the 10 feet of path immediately ahead. She slowed to nearly a walking pace. The suspension found every root and rut. She leaned forward over the wheel and drove by the thin light of the high beams and the instructions of the GPS, which had stopped updating in any specific way and was simply telling her to continue on the current road. Then the trees stopped. The clearing appeared the way clearings appear in dense forest all at once, a sudden release of space and sky, the trees simply deciding to step back. She pulled the Civic into the clearing's edge and shut the engine off and sat in the silence that came flooding in, the specific, thick silence of deep woods at night, more textured and present than any urban quiet. She got out. The air was different here than the air in Greenwich. Cleaner in a way that was almost aggressive, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold soil and the absence of everything coastal and urban. The sky above the clearing was dense with stars, the Milky Way visible as an actual smear of light, something she had not seen since a camping trip to the Adirondacks when she was 13. She turned on her phone's flashlight and aimed it at what occupied the center of the clearing. The house was an A-frame 2 stories, the steep roof line descending sharply on both sides. It had been white once. The paint had separated from the board siding in long curling strips that lifted at the edges and revealed the gray wood beneath. One of the upper windows was boarded from the inside with what looked like plywood. The porch roof sagged significantly at its midpoint, and the post nearest the steps had tilted outward at the base, rotted through by water infiltration. The whole structure communicated long abandonment in the way that abandoned structures do not, through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of small ones. Each one individually manageable, collectively a surrender. A man who had managed $1 billion company had owned this property for at least 14 months and probably longer, had structured its ownership through a shell company and pointed his daughter here with the last instructions he would ever give her. Sadie stood in the clearing for a long time with the stars above her and the forest around her and the dilapidated A-frame and the flashlight beam, and she breathed the cold Wisconsin air, and she thought about her father driving whatever route he had driven to get here, perhaps alone, perhaps telling no one, constructing the next stage of whatever he was building. He had said, "Look up." He had said it on the index card from the bank box, and he had said it in the letter from the tackle box, the same 2 words in both places, and her father did not repeat himself without intention. When he said something twice, it was because the saying needed to happen twice. She walked across the clearing, her boots finding solid ground through the wet leaves. She tested each porch step before trusting it with her weight and found them soft but structurally present. She stood before the front door, old wood with a tarnished brass knob and a deadbolt that had seen its last regular use some years ago, and she pulled the brass key from the lanyard around her wrist and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism was stiff. She applied steady pressure and felt the resistance build and then resolve as the key turned and the door swung inward on hinges that protested with the specific complaint of metal that has not moved in a long time. Cold, sealed air came out to meet her. Dust and mildew and something organic underneath the long-dead memory of wood smoke. She raised her phone. The flashlight beam cut into the interior. The living room assembled itself around the moving light. Furniture under canvas sheets yellowed with years. A stone fireplace on the far wall, its iron grate rusted to a deep orange. Hardwood floors buried under a uniform layer of fine gray dust that had settled and compacted and served for however long the house had been empty as a faithful and precise record of everything that had passed through. She brought the beam down to the floor and held it steady. The dust was not undisturbed. There were footprints in it. Not old ones, not hers. These were large, deeply grooved, the impressions left by boots with substantial tactical tread, and the edges of the displaced dust were sharp and well-defined, not blurred or softened by time. Recent. Someone had been in this house within the last few days. Sadie stood very still in the dark interior of her father's secret property in the Wisconsin woods and listened to the silence, and she did not move, and she cataloged what she knew. Someone had found the property. Someone had been here recently. Someone with tactical boots, which meant someone professional rather than curious. Then she made a decision. She followed the footprints. They led straight through the living room with the directional certainty of someone who had come with a specific purpose rather than general curiosity. No wandering, no doubling back. Straight through to the narrow hallway along the back of the first floor, and from there into a room at the end that had been at some point a study. The study had been thoroughly searched. An oak desk against the far wall had every drawer pulled out and overturned. Papers lay across the floor in drifts, some curled with moisture, some still flat and legible, all of them the administrative residue of a property held at a minimum level for years. County tax assessments, utility invoices to Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. A contractor's estimate for roof repair from 4 years ago never apparently acted upon. The canvas that had covered the desk had been yanked off and left in a pile. The search had been frustrated. That was the message of the room, the language of disruption without conclusion. People who find what they are looking for stop pulling things apart. They remove the target and leave. They do not leave the place looking like this. They had not found it. She went back to the hallway. The footprints continued up the staircase at the far end, wooden treads groaning under her careful weight as she followed them. The second floor was small, a bathroom, a bedroom at the end of the short hall. The footprints circled the bedroom, systematically checked the walk-in closet on the left wall, the door of which was standing open and then turned back toward the stairs. The intruder had left. Sadie stood in the bedroom and looked at the open closet. She looked at the ceiling above the shelving inside it, lower than the bedroom ceiling, a drop section. She looked at the shelves, old painted wood in 3 tiers, the top shelf at roughly shoulder height. She thought about the 2 words on the index card, the 2 words in the letter. Look up. Her father had embedded them in both places with the deliberateness of a man who understood that emphasis is a form of trust, that to repeat something is to say, I believe in your ability to find this. She stepped into the closet. 5 feet by 7 roughly, built-in shelves along the left wall. She stood at the back and aimed her light at the ceiling directly above the junction of the top shelf in the rear wall. The ceiling was covered with acoustic tiles, the commercial drop ceiling variety, white composite squares in a metal grid yellowed in uniform. The kind of ceiling detail that the eye processes and immediately dismisses as background. Except in the far corner above the top shelf's rear edge, one tile was not quite flush with its neighbors. The gap was barely a suggestion, a hairline of darkness at the tile's edge, a 1/4 inch at most, visible only because the light was coming from the exact angle she was holding her phone. She climbed onto the top shelf. The wood flexed but held. She pressed both palms flat against the corner tile and pushed upward. The tile slid aside on its track, releasing a cascade of insulation debris, an accumulated grime, and the bodies of insects that had died in the sealed space above. She turned away, coughing hard. When she cleared her eyes and aimed the light back into the opening, what she saw stopped everything. A drop-down aluminum ladder folded into the opening 3 sections, the kind rated for regular residential use. The bottom rung was resting 2 inches above the tile grid, balanced there, as if someone had set it down with care. The dust on the rungs was even and undisturbed. The intruder had been in this closet, had circled it, had looked at the ceiling, had not found what she was looking at because they had looked without being told to look, without the specific reason that goes deeper than professional thoroughness. She gripped the bottom rung and pulled. The ladder descended with a series of metallic sounds that rang through the quiet house like a series of announcements, each section locking into place with a clank that the silence amplified. She held still after the last one and listened. Nothing. The house was quiet. The woods beyond it were quiet. She began to climb. The attic opened around her as she rose through the hatch, vast and dark, and smelling of cedar and decades of sealed cold air. She pulled herself up onto the plywood floor and stood and swept the flashlight from left to right. The attic spanned the full length of the house. Steep A-frame roofline on both sides descending to within 4 feet of the floor at the eaves. Solid plywood underfoot, better maintained than anything below. A few cardboard boxes against the near wall collapsed flat. Empty. At the far end of the attic, caught in the beam of her light as if placed deliberately in the composition, was a safe. Not a residential safe, not a fireproof box, a vault. 6 feet tall brushed steel with a heavy wheel mechanism on the door and a digital keypad to the right of the wheel, anchored to the load-bearing structural beams of the house with bolts as thick as her thumb. It looked like something removed from a bank or a currency exchange or a government installation, something built to survive, not just robbery, but catastrophe. She crossed the attic at a near-run, boots loud on the plywood, and stopped in front of it. The keypad was destroyed. The digital display was dark. The housing around it was cracked and deformed from impact, scored along the bottom edge and across the face with the deep parallel grooves of an angle grinder, the metal blackened in the grooves from friction heat. Someone had brought the right tools and had worked with determination and had not gotten through. She stood in front of the ruined keypad and felt the specific weight of having traveled a very long way to arrive at a wall. She pressed her palm flat against the cold steel door. It did not move. 6 inches of hardened steel between her and whatever was inside, and the electronic access point deliberately destroyed. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she looked more carefully, not at the shattered display, not at the scored steel, at the border where the keypad housing met the safe door, the narrow seam between plastic and steel. And there, adhering to the steel by the last failing grip of old tape, was a small yellow sticky note, curled at one corner. The handwriting was her father's, compressed to fit the small space pen pressed hard into the paper. Sadie, if the keypad is broken, look behind the panel. She read it twice. Then she took the folding knife from her hoodie pocket and worked the blade carefully behind the lower edge of the cracked housing. The plastic resisted, then gave with a sharp snap, one piece falling to the plywood. She peeled away the housing in sections, careful with the dangling wires, setting the pieces aside. Behind the removed housing, flush against the cold face of the vault, was a machined circle of steel approximately 2 inches in diameter, perfectly smooth with a keyhole at its center. A mechanical lock, completely independent of the destroyed electronic system. Invisible behind the housing. Untouched by the angle grinder because the angle grinder had been aimed at the wrong target. She reached into her hoodie pocket and took out the bank key, the one she had pocketed when she left the viewing room at First National, keeping it because leaving it behind had felt wrong without her understanding why. She looked at the key. She looked at the keyhole. She held the key over the opening. She slid it in. It went in without resistance, the way a key goes into a lock designed for it. She turned it. What came from inside the vault was not the click of a simple lock, but the deep sequential thudding of heavy internal bolts releasing a mechanical sound she could feel through the steel and through her palm and up into her wrist. Something massive that had been held gave way. She gripped the wheel with both hands, braced her boots against the plywood, and pulled. The door was heavier than she had anticipated, heavier than any door she had ever opened. The weight of serious engineering applied to a serious purpose, and it moved with the friction of a sealed thing long undisturbed. The hinges groaned deeply. She kept pulling, using her entire body, stepping back and letting the momentum build, and the door swung open with a long, sustained moan that filled the whole attic and then stopped. The interior of the vault was lit by a battery-powered LED strip along the top shelf, backup lighting, independent of any power source, which flickered once when the seal broke, and then held, casting clean white light across the contents arranged on 3 shelves. On the bottom shelf, organized with the precision of someone who understood they would not be present to explain their choices, were bricks of currency shrink-wrapped in plastic, 7 of them stacked flat. Beside the currency were 3 velvet pouches closed with drawstrings, each one heavy and dense with something small and solid. On the middle shelf centered were 3 objects. A journal, black leather, thick, its pages densely filled with writing visible at the edges. 2 external hard drives in protective cases designed for field use. And a manila envelope sealed with multiple layers of tape with a single word written across the face in permanent marker, with the broad strokes of someone who intended the word to be readable under any conditions. Checkmate. Sadie stood in front of the open vault and looked at these objects and understood that she was looking at the last year of her father's life organized into physical form. The fear and the love and the refusal to let things end the way they were being arranged to end. He had built this. All of it. The LLC, the deed, the bank box, the false bottom in the tackle box, the hidden ladder in the closet ceiling, the mechanical backup lock behind the destroyed keypad, the battery strip in the vault, so there would be light when she got here. He had built it all for her, constructed it from whatever time and clarity he could find in the months he spent knowing what was happening, and being unable to stop it. And he had built it because he trusted that she would find it. Because she was his compass, and he had been betting on that compass since she was 11 years old in a canoe. She sat down cross-legged on the plywood floor in front of the vault and reached for the envelope. She pulled the tape free in strips and opened the flap and spread the documents across her knees in the vault's white light. The first document was a will. She knew the format immediately, having seen one recently in a conference room that smelled of leather and new carpet. She found the date near the top of the first page, 5 days before Edward Wyatt's death. The language left nothing ambiguous. Edward Robert Wyatt, being of sound and disposing mind, hereby revoked all prior wills and testamentary instruments. He left his entire estate, the company, the real property, all liquid and investment assets, all accounts and holdings, to his daughter Sadie Christine Wyatt. Diana Crane Wyatt was explicitly disinherited, the word used without softening, citing irreconcilable breaches of trust and fiduciary misconduct. Prescott Crane was similarly disinherited with a single exception, a conditional trust of $250,000 held in escrow contingent on his having had no knowledge of or participation in any actions taken against the estate or its rightful heirs. The witnesses were 3 people she did not know: a notary public from Windsor County, Vermont, a retired Superior Court judge from Middlesex County, Massachusetts, a board-certified internist from private practice in Albany, New York. None of them connected to anything Aldrich Hollis or Diana Crane Wyatt could have reached or anticipated. The will that Aldrich Hollis had read in his conference room, signed 3 weeks before her father died, had been superseded by this document, signed 5 days before he died, by a man who in those final days had somehow found a notary and a retired judge and a physician in 3 different locations and gotten them to witness his signature and attest to his competence. He had done that while they were killing him. She set the will on the plywood beside her and picked up the second document. It was a report from a laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland. The letterhead was in German and English. It was dated 8 months before her father's death. It was a toxicological analysis of a blood sample, the sample identified by a coded reference number, rather than a name, conducted at the request of a private consulting physician. She read the English sections carefully. The sample contained the heart medications her father had been prescribed at expected therapeutic concentrations. It also contained, at subtherapeutic but biologically active concentrations, a synthetic compound not present in any of his prescriptions. The compound was described as a stimulant analog structurally related to amphetamine derivatives, capable of elevating heart rate and arterial blood pressure through specific physiological pathways. At the concentrations detected, the report stated chronic exposure would place significant additional cardiovascular strain on a cardiac system already compromised by underlying structural abnormality. She read that sentence again, then the sentence that followed it: chronic exposure. She put the toxicology report on the plywood and picked up the attached documents. Printed emails, pages of them. She read through them in the vault light. 2 email addresses, one registered through a privacy proxy in Delaware, its origin obscured, the other displaying a name she recognized in the sender field: A. Hollis. The emails discussed a nurse referred to only by initials who had been recruited into an arrangement involving the medication. They discussed the procurement of the compound through channels that were not directly named, but were described with enough specificity to be traceable. They discussed timing and dosage and the management of suspicion, the need for patience when outcomes needed to appear organic rather than induced. One email dated 9 months before her father's death read, "The cardiologist's assessment indicates natural deterioration on the projected timeline. Without acceleration, 18 to 24 months remains the estimate, with the supplement considerably less." Another 3 months later, he has begun skipping doses irregularly. The nurse reports he is becoming watchful without being able to articulate what he is watching for. Suggest considering acceleration. She stopped reading. She sat on the plywood floor of the attic of her father's hidden house in the Wisconsin forest, and she held the printed emails in both hands, and she understood what she was holding. They had killed him, not in any moment of violence, slowly pharmacologically across 8 months, replacing his prescribed medication with something calculated to push a compromised heart past the point it could sustain. Monitoring the deterioration, adjusting when he grew suspicious, waiting with the patience of people who believed they controlled the timeline. Her father had figured it out. He had written about it in the journal she would learn later, the full arc of his realization documented in the careful, precise language of a man who had built a company from nothing and understood that documentation is its own form of power. He had noticed the clarity that returned on the days he secretly skipped his medication. He had thought backward through the preceding months and seen the shape of what had been done. And then he had moved, with whatever time remained to build this. Private physician in another state. Blood draw sent to Switzerland. 3 independent witnesses in 3 different locations for a new will. Property transferred to an LLC registered in his daughter's name. Letters hidden in fishing tackle boxes. Keys left in bank vaults. 2 words scratched on index cards in the handwriting that was still recognizably his underneath all the urgency and the fear and the physical deterioration being chemically induced in his body. He had done all of it while they were killing him. He had done it for her. Sadie pressed the emails flat against her chest and closed her eyes and breathed. She allowed herself exactly that. One complete breath. One moment where the weight of it was simply weight, where she did not need to do anything with it yet. Then she opened her eyes. She heard a sound, faint, from outside, beyond the walls of the house and the insulation of the attic and the 2 floors of empty space beneath her. But her body had been operating at a heightened level of alertness for 3 weeks, calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities of sleeping in public spaces and moving through unfamiliar environments, and it processed the sound before her conscious mind did. Tires on gravel. She was on her feet before the thought completed itself. She moved to the circular ventilation window at the gable end of the attic, a louvered opening perhaps 14 inches across its wooden slats, brittle with age. She pressed her face to the louvers and looked down through the gaps. Headlights cut through the clearing below. A large SUV, dark, had pulled in from the logging road and stopped with its headlights aimed directly at her Honda Civic. The engine idled with the quiet authority of a well-maintained vehicle. The driver's door opened. A man got out, large, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket to mid-thigh. The boots, even from this elevation and this distance, had the profile she had last seen in the dust of the first floor. Thick-soled, tactical. He assessed the Civic and then turned his attention to the house. The same boots. He had been here before, and he had come back. The passenger door opened. A second man, older, silver-haired. He carried an umbrella that he opened against the light rain that had begun while she was in the attic. A dark trench coat, well cut. He stood on his side of the vehicle and looked at the house the way certain experienced men look at problems, not with urgency, but with the settled calculation of someone for whom this situation is simply a matter to be resolved through the correct application of resources. From 2 floors up, through warped ventilation louvers in the dark and the rain, she knew him by the shape of his stillness, the particular forward incline of his head when thinking, the way he held the umbrella closer to the canopy than to the handle. Aldrich Hollis. The man who had sat 3 feet from her in a conference room with his hands folded and his eyes averted and had read a fraudulent document without missing a word. The man her father had written about on yellow legal paper with a shaking hand. The man whose name appeared on the printed emails discussing the optimal timeline for her father's death. His voice carried through the quiet clearing, measured and carrying the particular ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. Her car is here. She found the property. The larger man moved toward the front of the house. His voice was lower and she caught only parts of it through the louvers. She heard Hollis clearly the way she heard everything in that moment, with abnormal acuity, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man resolving an administrative problem. If she has seen what is in that safe, she cannot leave these woods. Make it appear opportunistic. The location is isolated enough. Sadie pulled back from the ventilation window. She was very calm. This was the fact she would think about in the days that followed the quality of her own response in that specific moment. Not panic, not paralysis. Something closer to the absolute transparency that arrives when everything extraneous burns away and only the essential remains. She could see the vault with its door still open and the battery light still burning. She could see the documents on the plywood. She could hear already the front door of the house being forced open below her. She moved. She crossed the attic to the vault and did not hesitate. She took the journal from the middle shelf. She took both hard drives. She took the will and the toxicology report and the printed emails and returned them to the manila envelope, pressing the flap closed. She took the heaviest of the three velvet pouches from the lower shelf and two of the shrink-wrapped currency bricks. She opened her backpack and placed everything inside, organizing by density, journal and drives toward the back. Envelope and pouches in the middle, currency at the bottom. She zipped it closed. She left the remaining currency and the two other pouches. She could not carry everything. She did not need everything. What was on her back was what mattered. Footsteps below, moving through the living room. She could feel them in the structure of the house as low vibrations rather than hear them directly transmitted upward through the load-bearing members and into the plywood beneath her feet. She put the backpack on her front, looping both straps over her shoulders so the bag rested against her chest. It was heavy. It would not snag. She went to the gable window. The louvers were rotting, held in their frame by the inertia of their original installation and nothing more. She lay flat on her back, brought both feet up, and kicked with everything she had. The wood exploded outward, louvers shattering into the dark, in the rain the sound of it enormous and startling in the attic silence. Cold, wet air rushed in through the opening. From below and close, a voice suddenly alert, "She's up there." She did not wait. She pushed her shoulders through the opening, turned to face the roof surface, and pulled herself out onto the A-frame. The rain had made the shingles slick with the thin, treacherous film of moisture over moss. She hit the roof surface and started sliding immediately, her palms finding nothing to grip her boots, skating across the wet shingles toward the edge, and the two-story drop to the concrete patio below. She went flat. Full body contact, arms spread, maximizing friction. She slowed. Her boot heel caught on the lifted edge of a shingle ridge, and she stopped feet inches from the gutter. A flashlight beam swung through the broken window behind her. A voice breathing hard from the climb, "She's on the roof." She did not look back. She looked right. The large oak tree that grew at the eastern corner of the house had a primary branch extending over the roof line, a limb thick as her forearm and long. It crossed above her at perhaps 6 feet of lateral distance, close enough that she could see its bark texture in the intermittent light. 6 feet across a wet, sloped, moss-covered roof surface in the dark, with a heavy backpack against her chest and a person coming through the window behind her. She moved toward it anyway. She went sideways across the roof on her belly, pushing with her boots against the shingle ridges, pulling with her fingertips at any edge she could find, making progress in small, deliberate increments. The rain fell steadily. The flashlight swung behind her. She heard the sounds of someone navigating through the broken window frame. She reached the junction of the gable wall and the main roof line, pushed herself up to one knee, and grabbed the oak branch with both hands. It held her weight. She let herself fall off the edge of the roof and into the tree. The branches came up through the dark in rapid sequence, each one striking a different part of her body: her shoulder, her hip, the back of her left forearm, tearing leaves and small twigs away in a rushing cascade of sound and impact. She turned as she fell and caught a primary limb with both elbows, the impact driving the air from her lungs in a hard grunt. She hung there for a moment, perhaps 8 feet above the ground, and then dropped. She hit the wet ferns at the base of the oak, and her left ankle took the impact at an angle, and the pain arrived immediately, sharp and total, and radiating up through the joint into her shin. She lay in the ferns for exactly 2 seconds, assessing. The joint would hold. It would hurt. It would hold. She got up. From above, from the roof or the window, she could not tell. She went into the trees. She ran. Not toward her car. The SUV was parked directly behind it, blocking it completely, and even if she reached it, the engine sound would place her instantly, and the logging road was the only exit, and they would be behind her in seconds. She ran north into the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing from where she had parked into the forest. The Wisconsin forest at night without artificial light is a fundamentally different environment than anything the human perceptual system is calibrated for. The trees were presences rather than objects, dark masses that registered more as felt than seen. The ground beneath the wet leaves was irregular in ways that could not be anticipated, root systems creating ridges and depressions that the foot discovered without warning. She put her right forearm up to protect her eyes from branches at face level and ran with the backpack against her chest, altering her direction every few hundred feet to avoid a straight line that could be followed. Behind her, at intervals that grew less frequent, she heard sounds. A light swept through the trees far to her left, searching the wrong sector. She adjusted away from it without slowing. She ran until she could not hear anything behind her but the forest itself. The ankle made itself known with every step in a consistent, specific way that she was able to factor in to run through rather than stop for. The adrenaline was doing what it does, negotiating with pain on her behalf without eliminating it, making it a condition of the terrain rather than a reason to stop. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the rain and the cold and the weight of the bag against her chest. After what she estimated was a mile and a half, the trees thinned. The ground firmed underfoot. The cloud cover had broken enough to let the moon establish itself in narrow bands of light through the canopy. She slowed to a walk, her breathing ragged and uneven, and listened. No sounds of pursuit, no lights in the forest behind her. She waited a full minute completely still and heard only the rain and the wind and the distant sound of water moving somewhere in the dark. She kept moving east, using the moss on the north-facing sides of the trees and the moon's position to maintain her bearing, working toward the county highway she had driven in on hours ago. She walked for just under 2 hours. The forest became a field. The field became a drainage ditch. The ditch ran alongside a paved 2-lane road. She climbed the embankment and stood on the asphalt shoulder and looked in both directions. Empty road, flat farmland, the eastern horizon showing the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn. She was soaked through every layer of clothing. The ankle had stiffened during the walk into a presence that required constant management. Her face had been marked by branches she had not seen in time, and her left forearm had a shallow cut from something she had moved through rather than around. The backpack rested against her chest. She pressed her hands against it and felt the solidity of what was inside. She stood on the road and breathed. After approximately 20 minutes, she heard the approach of a large diesel engine, the specific resonant signature of a long-haul rig, and saw headlights appear on the horizon moving toward her. She stepped to the shoulder's edge and raised her arm. The truck was a full rig with a refrigerated trailer, and it slowed and pulled onto the shoulder with the massive, careful deceleration of something large that has been guided by an experienced hand, the air brakes releasing with a long sigh. The driver's window came down. He was in his mid-60s with a close-trimmed gray beard and the deep stillness of someone who has spent the majority of his working life in a small space with a long road ahead and has made peace with both. He looked at her for a moment, taking in the wet clothes and the cut on her forearm, and the deliberate way she was distributing her weight to favor the left ankle. He took in the backpack held against her chest with both arms. He asked no questions. He reached across the cab and opened the passenger door. She climbed in. The cab was warm and smelled of coffee in the specific staleness of a space that is lived in continuously rather than visited. He handed her a paper towel from a roll mounted on the dash. She pressed it against the cut on her arm. He eased back onto the highway without a word and increased speed to cruising. They drove in silence. He turned the heat up slightly. The warmth came from the vents below the dash and moved up through her wet clothes, and the pain in her ankle settled into a dull, persistent presence that was manageable as long as she did not flex the joint. She held the backpack on her lap and watched the road unreel ahead of the headlights, the white center line steady and continuous, the Wisconsin farmland dark on both sides. After approximately an hour, he glanced at her briefly and said in the measured way of someone who has chosen his words with care and brevity, "I go through Chicago if that helps." She told him it did. She thanked him. He nodded once and returned his attention to the road. She looked out through the windshield at the road ahead, and thought about the vault and the documents and the email that had discussed her father's deterioration on schedule. She thought about the will signed 5 days before his death by a man who had somehow found the strength and clarity to reach three independent witnesses in three different states while being slowly killed by what was being put into his medication. She thought about the system of contingencies he had constructed, the multiple layers of it, each one leading to the next, each one designed to be found only by someone who had been told where to look, who had a specific reason to look up. She thought about what she was carrying. She thought about what she was going to do with it. The truck moved south through the Wisconsin night and into the first light of a Wisconsin morning. She held the backpack and watched the road and did not sleep. Chicago assembled itself through the windshield as the sun cleared the horizon. The towers first as shapes against the brightening sky, and then as specific structures as the city grew around the highway. The driver took the downtown exit and navigated the morning surface streets with the practiced ease of someone who has made this approach many times, pulling to the curb on a block of federal and commercial buildings 3 blocks east of the lakefront. She climbed down from the cab, favoring the left ankle on the step. She turned back. He was looking at the road ahead in the manner of people who help without needing the help acknowledged. She thanked him. She meant it in a way that the word was not fully equipped to carry. He nodded once and pulled the door closed and drove. She stood on the sidewalk in the morning light of a weekday in a large city, which meant the sidewalk was moving with people who had places to be and coffee in their hands, and none of them looked at her for more than a second before looking away, which is one of the genuine mercies of urban density. She knew what she needed. She had sorted it on the drive down with the focused analytical clarity her father had spent her childhood modeling for her, the habit of working through problems not by their apparent urgency, but by their actual leverage. What needed to happen first? What made everything else possible? She could not go to local law enforcement. Her father's journal, which she had not yet read in full, but had skimmed in the vault's white light, had been specific about this. Aldrich Hollis had spent 18 years cultivating relationships throughout the legal infrastructure of Fairfield County. The kind of relationships built not through friendship, but through the reliable management of sensitive information and the resulting accumulation of influence over people who preferred not to test that influence. The local system was not a place she could bring what she was carrying and expect a clean landing. The federal system was different. The federal system had its own jurisdiction and its own structure and its own immunity to the kind of local arrangements Hollis had spent years constructing. More specifically, the federal system had jurisdiction over wire fraud cases involving companies whose operations crossed state lines, which was precisely what Wyatt Group did every day with every transaction. She walked 3 blocks north and found the building she had identified on her phone during the final stretch of the drive, a federal office building with the American flag above the entrance, and the particular institutional gravity of places where the weight of law is present as a physical quality of the air. Security screening at the entrance, 2 guards, a reception desk staffed by a woman who processed Sadie's appearance with professional neutrality. Sadie told her she needed to speak with someone in the FBI field office regarding a murder case and a federal wire fraud scheme involving a private company with interstate commerce operations. She said she had physical evidence, including documentary and digital materials. The woman asked her to wait and pointed toward a row of chairs along the near wall. Sadie sat. She put the backpack on her lap and pressed her hands flat on top of it and looked at the middle distance and waited. 23 minutes later, a woman came through the secure door beside the reception desk and walked toward her with the economic movement of someone who has learned not to spend energy on gesture. She was approximately 50 with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been shaped by professional experience into an expression of watchful neutrality, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present and assessing. Dark blazer, flat shoes, credentials clipped to her jacket. The name on them read Special Agent Ruth Calloway. She looked at Sadie with the specific attention of someone forming a preliminary judgment while withholding it. She said her name and asked Sadie's. Sadie told her. Calloway said she understood Sadie had information about a federal matter. Her tone was the careful non-committal of someone who has learned that the most efficient response to unverified claims is to gather information before forming any position about them. Sadie said yes. She said she had documentary evidence of first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder, the fraudulent revision of a legal will in a wire fraud scheme involving a private company whose supply chain operations cross state lines and whose financial records implicate multiple parties in a premeditated conspiracy extending over 4 years. Calloway looked at her for a moment. She said, "Follow me." The room they used had a table and 4 chairs and a one-way mirror along one wall and a camera near the ceiling. Calloway sat across from Sadie. A second agent, male younger, positioned himself to the side with a legal pad. Calloway placed her own legal pad on the table and a pen beside it and looked at Sadie and said from the beginning. Sadie told it from the beginning. She did not editorialize. She did not introduce emotion into the telling, not because she did not feel it, but because she understood that the person across from her needed information in a form that could be evaluated and acted upon, and that emotion, however legitimate, was interference in that particular signal. She was precise and sequential. Edward Wyatt, the cardiac condition, the marriage to Diana Crane Wyatt, the death, the will reading. Aldrich Hollis and the averted eyes. 3 weeks in a Honda Civic, the tackle box and the false bottom in the letter, the bank and the property deed and the brass key, the drive to Wisconsin, the house, the footprints in the dust, the closet ceiling and the hidden ladder, the attic and the vault with the destroyed keypad and the hidden mechanical lock, the silver key fitting, the vault opening, what was inside. When she reached the toxicology report, in the email she opened the backpack and laid the manila envelope on the table and pushed it toward Calloway. Calloway did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone whose preliminary assessment is being revised. Then she reached forward and opened the flap and began reading. Several minutes passed. The younger agent leaned in. Calloway turned pages with deliberate attention, reading the email printouts, twice examining the toxicology report header, and then the body of the report, and then the header again. She set the documents down and looked at Sadie. She said, "The safe you took these from. It was in a property registered to a company of which you are the documented sole owner." Sadie said yes. She said, "And the access to that property was established through documents your father created more than a year before his death." Sadie said yes. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Excuse me," and stood and took the documents and left the room. Sadie sat with the younger agent, who maintained his practiced neutrality of presence without engagement. She looked at the table surface and pressed her palms flat against it, the same grounding gesture she had used on the backpack on the sidewalk outside, locating herself in something solid. She thought about her father sitting in a physician's office in another state, extending his arm for a blood draw, making the record of what was being done to him, because he understood that records have power, and he was running out of time to accumulate them. She thought about him driving to Vermont to find a notary, to a retired judge in Massachusetts, to a physician in Albany, gathering the signatures that would make the real will unassailable. She thought about him going back to Pemberton Drive afterward and taking his evening medication and lying awake knowing what the medication contained and choosing to take it anyway because stopping would signal awareness and he needed more time. He had done all of it alone. He had built this entire structure of protection for her while the people in his household were systematically ending his life, and he had done it without telling her, because telling her would have put her in the path of people who had already demonstrated what they were willing to do. He had carried it alone so she would not have to. 26 minutes later, Calloway returned with 2 additional people, a man in his 50s in a carefully pressed suit who introduced himself as a supervisory special agent, and a woman carrying a government-issue laptop. They sat. The supervisory agent asked Sadie to describe the chain of custody for each document, where each item had been physically located when she found it and under what circumstances. She walked through it again. She was specific. The tackle box on the passenger seat of the Civic in the study of the Greenwich estate moved from its usual location in the garage. The velvet pouch and yellow paper in the false bottom beneath the tray insert. The bank key in the pouch. The bank box accessible by her name on the authorized list added 3 years prior. The property deed and LLC certificate and brass key from the box. The attic access through the concealed ceiling panel in the walk-in closet. The vault anchored to the structural beams. The hidden mechanical lock behind the destroyed digital keypad. The silver bank key opening the mechanical lock. The envelope inside the vault. The supervisory agent looked at the toxicology report for a long time. He examined the email printouts with the careful attention of someone reading not just the content, but the metadata around it. The header information, the formatting, the physical condition of the printed pages. He asked her to describe the physical state of the documents when she found them, the condition of the envelope, whether anything had been disturbed. She described what she had observed with as much precision as she could. He conferred quietly with Calloway. Then he told her they would need to retain the physical documents for forensic analysis and that she would receive detailed receipts for each item. He asked whether she had any additional materials from the vault. She reached into the backpack and brought out the 2 hard drives in their protective cases. She set them on the table. She told him she had not had equipment to access them and did not know their specific contents, only that her father had placed them in the vault deliberately alongside the documents. He looked at the drives and said something quietly to the woman with the laptop who made a note. He asked whether Sadie had a safe place to stay in Chicago. She looked at him steadily and said no. He said the Bureau would arrange accommodation. He said she was not to contact any party involved in the estate or the probate proceedings. He said someone would contact her within 24 hours. Calloway walked her out of the building. At the door, she handed Sadie a card with a direct line. She told her the address of a federal contractor hotel 2 blocks north where a room had been reserved. She told her to see the federal medical office on the 3rd floor of the building for the ankle before leaving. She said it with the efficient directness of someone for whom the practical version of concern is the most useful version. Sadie went to the medical office. A physician's assistant examined the ankle, confirmed it was a moderate lateral sprain without structural damage, wrapped it with a proper bandage, gave her an ice pack, and a set of instructions she would follow with unusual compliance given the circumstances. Then she walked to the hotel. The room was plain and clean and warm. She stood in the shower for a very long time. She ordered room service for the first time in 3 weeks and sat on the edge of the bed and ate everything they brought without tasting most of it, and looked at the wall and did not think about anything in particular, which was what the mind does when it has held too much and needs a brief vacancy before it can continue. She lay down on top of the covers in the afternoon light. She did not sleep immediately. She lay still in the clean room and listened to the sound of the city outside, the traffic and the wind off the lake, and the ordinary continuous noise of a large place operating at full capacity, and she thought about her father's voice, the specific register of it, the way it moved when he was explaining something he found genuinely interesting, which was most things. She thought about the way he had looked at her across a canoe when she was 11 years old, in the moment before he said quietly, almost to himself, that she was his compass. Then she slept. She slept for 14 hours. Her phone woke her. It was Calloway. What happened across the following 72 hours carried the momentum of an institution that has decided with the full weight of a federal mandate to move. The hard drives had been decrypted by the forensic technology team overnight. Their contents were in Calloway's careful language when she sat down with Sadie 2 days later, extensive and highly relevant. Edward Wyatt had been more thorough than even the documents in the manila envelope had suggested. The drives contained 4 years of financial records tracing communications between Aldrich Hollis and Diana Crane Wyatt, wire transfer documentation, detailing transactions through shell entities in Delaware and the Caymans, and records of a systematic embezzlement scheme planned for execution immediately upon completion of the fraudulent probate process. The financial architecture, which had been designed to be difficult to follow, became under forensic accounting analysis a clear and documented picture of premeditated conspiracy that had been in preparation for longer than even the email timeline suggested. There were also files Sadie had not anticipated. Her father had maintained a clinical log of his own physical deterioration, correlating his symptoms with his medication schedule across the months he had been aware of what was happening. He had recorded the quality of his cognition on days when he had covertly modified his intake and observed the clarity that returned. He had written about Diana with the precision of someone constructing a legal document rather than a personal account, because he understood that the account would eventually need to serve as evidence, and that its value would depend on its exactness rather than its feeling. He had known by the final months that he was not going to survive what was being done to him. He had spent the time he had ensuring that what was being done to him would not be allowed to stand. On the morning of the third day, the operation moved. Sadie was in the hotel room when Calloway called to tell her it was beginning. She did not request to be present. She did not ask for operational details. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the Chicago skyline and waited. She had made one specific request of Calloway the previous afternoon, stated in the precise and measured terms she had learned were the effective register for these conversations. She had asked that Prescott Crane's culpability be assessed with care and separately from Diana's, and she had explained the reasoning behind the request based on what she had observed and what she had inferred from the documents. She had been explicit that she was not asking for any particular outcome, only for the distinction to be recognized and investigated rather than assumed away. Calloway had listened without expression and written something on her legal pad. The simultaneous operations took approximately 40 minutes from first entry to full detention. 3 approach vectors on the estate at Pemberton Drive in Greenwich, timed for 7 in the morning, early enough to preclude coordinated response, late enough that the activity would register in the neighborhood's awareness, which carried its own weight as a message. Diana Crane Wyatt came to the door herself. Calloway described it to Sadie later with her characteristic economy of language. The door had opened. There had been a fraction of a second in which Diana had registered what was standing on her porch. In the composure she had built and maintained across years of calculated behavior, had undergone a change that was not quite collapse, but was structurally adjacent to it. She had looked at the credentials. She had looked at the agents behind them. She had looked at the street behind the agents as if assessing the distance between what was happening and what she had until that moment believed to be the fixed and settled nature of her circumstances. Prescott Crane appeared at the top of the staircase behind her as the agents entered. He was 22 years old and wearing jeans and a university sweatshirt, and he looked, Calloway said, not like a participant who had been caught, but like a person watching something happen that they do not fully understand and are afraid of understanding. He did not run. He did not speak. He came down the stairs when instructed and sat in the living room of the house that Edward Wyatt's money had built and answered the initial questions put to him in a voice that was quiet and, Calloway noted, consistent. Simultaneously across Greenwich, Aldrich Hollis was in the middle of a board meeting at the offices of a real estate holding company for which his firm provided primary legal counsel. 3 federal agents entered the conference room. The other people at the table were still. Hollis looked at the approaching agents with the expression of a man who has been waiting at some level beneath his conscious accounting for a specific door to open, and who discovers in the moment of its opening that the waiting has been its own form of exhaustion, and that what he feels now is something that resembles, in its own distorted way, a kind of relief. He did not make it easy after that first moment. He understood legal procedure thoroughly and deployed that understanding with the precision of long practice. But the initial expression in the conference room before the professional mechanisms fully engaged was not the expression of a man who was surprised. Garrett Wren was not located at either address. He became the subject of a separate federal fugitive warrant initiated the same morning as the coordinated arrests. 9 days later, acting on information developed through the investigation's financial records agents, located him at a rental property in rural central Pennsylvania. He did not resist. He was transported to a federal holding facility in Chicago and charged with criminal conspiracy, assault with a deadly weapon in the commission of a federal crime, and additional counts relating to his activities at the Wisconsin property and his role in the broader conspiracy. Sadie learned most of these details from Calloway across a series of meetings over the following weeks, each one adding another layer to the picture she was assembling from the evidence and the testimony and the developing legal proceedings. The picture was not simple. it was not in some places easy to look at directly. She looked at it anyway with the systematic attention she had inherited from a man who had built a company by understanding problems exactly rather than approximately. The meeting about Prescott occurred on a gray midweek afternoon in a federal conference room. Calloway brought a prosecutor from the case team, a man named Wentworth, who had been developing the wire fraud and financial conspiracy portions of the indictment for weeks, and who wore reading glasses on a cord and chose his words with the visible care of someone who understood their specific gravity. What the investigation had established about Prescott Crane was the following. He had known about the fraudulent will. He had been physically present at discussions between his mother and Aldrich Hollis in which the will revision was planned. He had known that Sadie was being deprived of an inheritance she was legally and morally owed, and he had taken no action to alter or disclose that. What he had not known was the rest of it. The email exchanges had occurred through channels he had no access to. The arrangement with the private duty nurse had been orchestrated entirely between Diana and Hollis without his participation. The toxicology report, the compound, the 8-month pharmacological campaign against a man with a structurally compromised heart, none of this had been communicated to him. The investigation had found no evidence of his awareness. When federal agents had placed the toxicology report on the table in front of Prescott Crane during his interview and explained what the document described, his response had been documented precisely. He had read the report once. He had set it down on the table with a deliberateness that the interviewing agent had noted as the deliberateness of a man managing something overwhelming. He had sat without speaking or moving for 47 seconds. The agent had recorded the duration. Then he had asked in a voice the interview notes described as barely produced whether the document was authentic. The agent had told him it was. Prescott Crane had put both hands over his face and had remained in that position for just over 3 minutes. When he looked up, he had said he would tell them everything he knew. He said it without prompting, without calculation of legal benefit. He said it in the way of someone for whom a certain understanding has just arrived and who finds that there is only one response available to a person who intends to remain a person. He told them everything, the conversations in his mother's study, the specific language she had used about Sadie, the portrait she had painted over years. A young woman who was ungrateful, entitled unprepared, who would land on her feet because people like her always did, as if Sadie's being dispossessed were both inevitable and just. He told them about the afternoon Diana had directed him to stand beside her when Sadie was removed from the estate, and how he had stood there because she had asked him to, and because his entire life had been organized around the premise that his mother's version of events was the version that corresponded to reality. He told them about the moments across the previous year when something Edward Wyatt had said or done had registered as a form of attention he had not been prepared to receive. A genuine question about what he was interested in asked without agenda. A book left in his room with a passage marked the kind of thing Edward apparently did for people he wanted to reach. A 2-hour conversation in the garage about automotive engineering that had extended because Edward had genuinely enjoyed it and had not wanted it to end. Wentworth told Sadie with careful professional neutrality what the journal had confirmed. Edward Wyatt had written about Prescott. He had written about watching him across the dinner table and perceiving beneath the entitlement that Diana had spent 22 years constructing something worth reaching for. He had written about wanting more time for that project. He had written that if circumstances had been different, he believed Prescott Crane could have become someone worth knowing. He had written the conditional trust into the real will, $250,000, contingent on his having had no knowledge of or participation in what was being done. It was a carefully bounded gesture. But it was a gesture made by a man who, in the final days of a life that was being chemically terminated, had made room in his legal document for someone his wife had positioned as an enemy, because he could see past what his wife had made of the young man to something she had not yet managed to destroy. Sadie sat with all of this for a long time after the meeting ended. She thought about what it cost to revise a fixed understanding of a person. She thought about Prescott at the top of the stairs on the morning of the arrests in his jeans and his university sweatshirt, watching something happen that he didn't fully understand and was afraid to understand. She thought about 47 seconds of silence in a voice described as barely produced. She thought about 3 minutes with both hands over a face. She did not forgive him for standing at that door. She was not capable of it yet, and she had enough of her father in her to know that pretending to a feeling you do not have is its own form of dishonesty. But she thought about what Edward Wyatt had seen across the dinner table, and she thought about the conditional trust, and she thought about what it means to be the kind of person who makes room for others even when running out of time. And she understood that this was the specific quality of her father's character that she was going to be working toward for the rest of her life. She was not sure she could reach it. She thought she understood why he had established it as the standard. The legal proceedings move through the federal system with the velocity of cases that are thoroughly documented and prosecutorially strong. Diana Crane Wyatt was indicted on charges of first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder and federal wire fraud. Aldrich Hollis faced the same murder charges, plus additional counts related to the fraudulent revision of a testamentary document and the obstruction of estate and probate proceedings. The private duty nurse who had been recruited into the medication scheme was located, interviewed, and became a cooperating witness under a negotiated agreement. Her testimony provided precise corroboration of the mechanism and the timeline. The private duty nurse confirmed the specific dates on which the medication substitution had begun, the compound she had been given to administer, and the instructions she had received about dosage and the payment she had received through a series of transactions that the financial investigation had already traced. She confirmed that she had been told the substitution would not cause immediate harm, that it was a supplemental treatment Edward had approved but had not told his cardiologist about because of concerns about insurance implications. She confirmed that she had believed this explanation until she did not, and that by the time she stopped believing it, she had understood enough about her own legal exposure to continue. Her cooperation added the human operational layer to the documentary record the hard drives had established. The probate proceedings in Connecticut were stayed pending resolution of the federal criminal matter, and then revisited under the jurisdiction of a federal court with no connection to the local infrastructure Hollis had cultivated over 18 years. The fraudulent will, the one Hollis had read in his conference room, in the carefully modulated voice of a man reciting coordinates, was voided in its entirety. The authenticated will, the one signed 5 days before Edward's death, witnessed by a notary from Windsor County, Vermont, and a retired Middlesex County, Massachusetts Superior Court judge, and a board-certified Albany internist, was entered into the probate record and validated. Diana Crane Wyatt and Aldrich Hollis were convicted on all primary counts. The sentences were federal sentences, which meant no parole eligibility under the applicable statutes. They would not come home. The estate on Pemberton Drive, the investment accounts, the offshore structures, all of it returned to the name on the authenticated document. Sadie Christine Wyatt, 19 years old at the time of the verdict, 20 by the time the full transfer of legal and operational authority was complete. She stood in Wentworth's office when he handed her the summary documentation confirming the conclusion of the estate proceedings, and she held the papers in both hands, and she felt the weight of them. Not the paper weight, but the other kind, the weight of the route that had carried her from a parking lot on Pemberton Drive to a truck stop in rural Wisconsin to a federal building in Chicago, and through months of legal proceedings and forensic accounting and testimony and the grinding, unglamorous necessary work of a legal system doing the thing it exists to do. She thanked Wentworth. He nodded once, the small, precise nod of someone who has found his work meaningful and does not require the meaning to be stated. She thanked Calloway, who was standing near the door with the folder she had brought to this meeting, and who received the thanks with characteristic efficiency, telling Sadie to follow through on the ankle with a proper physical therapist and to call the direct line if anything came up. The first professional obligation Sadie discharged was a meeting with the board of Wyatt Group. She had prepared for it with the focused, methodical approach her father had spent her childhood modeling. She had read 3 years of annual reports and quarterly financial disclosures. She had reviewed the biographies and professional histories of every current board member. She had spoken at length with 2 retired logistics industry executives who had known Edward in the company's earlier years and who were willing to be candid about both the company's genuine strengths and the specific vulnerabilities that had developed in the 6 months since Edward's death, during which Diana had exercised temporary authority over the estate and had made personnel and governance changes that served interests other than the company's. She walked into the boardroom on a Tuesday morning. She was 20 years old. She wore a suit purchased with money from an account that was now in fact hers. She sat at the head of the table, which was the chair that was legally and operationally hers, and she looked at each person around the table in turn, and she told them in plain and specific language what was going to happen. 3 board members appointed under Diana's temporary authority were removed that day. Their replacements were drawn from a list her father had maintained in the back pages of his journal, annotated in his careful hand with brief character assessments that were she found when she cross-referenced them against her own research both accurate and notably generous. He had been watching these people for years. He had written down who could be trusted and had left that record in a place only she would find it against the day when the knowledge would be needed by someone who had not had the years to observe what he had observed. The executive team was rebuilt across the following months with a care that reflected her father's pace, rather than the urgency that external circumstances might have justified. She hired where gaps were structural and retained where retention was genuinely merited. And she listened more than she spoke in the first weeks because she was learning something that had not yet been taught to her, and listening was the most efficient available method. Some of the people she retained had worked alongside her father in the company's founding years, and they spoke about him in ways that added texture to the portrait she was assembling from the journal in the documents and her own 19 years of being in his vicinity. Details from the professional life that complemented and complicated and deepened the private life she had witnessed. She established the Edward Wyatt Foundation in the spring following the conviction. Its mandate was specific and deliberately bounded. Legal defense funding and advocacy for individuals who had been wrongfully disinherited or defrauded in estate proceedings, with particular emphasis on cases where the financial and institutional resources available to the aggrieved party were insufficient to effectively challenge complex, fraudulent documentation. She had thought about the scope of the mandate with the same analytical care she brought to company decisions. The machinery her father had built to protect her had required resources and foresight and a particular kind of preparation that most people do not have and could not have. She could not replicate the specific architecture for everyone, but she could ensure that the gap between what people were owed and what they were practically able to pursue through a legal system that required money to navigate was in specific cases closed. That was the thing she could do. She intended to do it. She sold the estate on Pemberton Drive. She had known she would from the moment the transfer of ownership was confirmed. She did not return to it after the sale was arranged. She instructed the estate agent to manage the inventory and staging and the transaction process, and she signed the documents when they were ready without attending the closing. The house held nothing she needed that she did not already have with her. She drove to Black River Falls in early June, the first time she had returned since the night she had run through the Wisconsin forest in the rain with a loaded backpack against her chest and a damaged ankle, and the footsteps of a man who had been instructed to make sure she did not leave the woods audible somewhere behind her. The logging road had been graded and filled at her instruction over the previous months, the worst of the ruts addressed. The surface maintained to something reliably passable. The clearing was the same clearing. The oak tree at the eastern corner was exactly where she had left it, its primary branch still extending over the roofline, with the same indifferent commitment to its own growth. The house was different. A contractor from La Crosse with a specialty in historic A-frame restoration had spent 4 months on it. The board siding had been refinished and repainted a clean white that the original must have been in its first years before the decades stripped it back to gray. The porch roof had been reframed and rehung on posts that were structurally sound. The boarded upper window was open now, new glass installed oriented to catch the morning light from the east. The interior walls had been repaired and replastered. The kitchen had been updated to functional without losing its character. The stone fireplace had been cleaned and the firebox relined, and the iron grate replaced with one that still looked old but actually worked. The attic was entirely its own room. She had specified its design herself in conversations with the contractor that extended longer than he had expected because the details mattered more than she had initially thought they would. The plywood subfloor had been replaced with hardwood wide plank oak finished with a matte oil that preserved the grain. Dormers had been cut into both sides of the steep roofline, four of them adding light and the feeling of height and openness in a space that had previously felt like a sealed dark. The walls were lined with built-in bookshelves, floor to ceiling, made from the same hardwood as the floor, and the windows in the dormers looked out over the clearing and the surrounding forest in all four cardinal directions. In the corner where the vault had been anchored to the structural beams, there was now a reading chair, a wide leather thing with good light from the nearest dormer facing the window that looked out on the oak tree. The vault itself was gone. The federal forensic team had removed it during the investigation, and it had not been returned, and she had not asked for it. She arrived at the property in the late afternoon of a day in early June, when the light was doing the thing it does in the upper Midwest in early summer, coming in at a long horizontal angle that turned ordinary surfaces the color of something precious and made the shadows of trees extend impossibly far across open ground. She parked in the clearing and sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the house in this light, the white siding warm in it, the dormers glowing, the oak at the eastern corner casting a shadow that reached halfway across the grass. She got out of the car. The porch steps were solid. The front door opened on hinges that had been cleaned and lubricated and reseated and moved now without friction or complaint, the way a door is supposed to move. Inside the house smelled of new wood and linseed oil and clean air. It was quiet with the specific quality of a place that has been prepared and is now simply waiting. The furniture was simple and well made and chosen because it fit the rooms and the light rather than because it communicated anything about cost or status. She walked through the living room and through the kitchen and stood at the back window looking out over the clearing where the forest began. The green tackle box was on the mantel above the stone fireplace. She had placed it there on the first day the renovation was complete, before the furniture was delivered, before anything else was in the house. It was the first object she had brought into the space, the thing the house needed to contain before anything else. The hardy featherweight reel that had occupied its compartmented tray was gone. Sold to a pawn shop on a gray November morning in Greenwich for $85 that had paid for a tank of gas in the beginning of a 500-mile drive north. She had tried to find it afterward, tracing the pawn shop's subsequent sale and then the buyer's eventual resale, and had gotten as far as a dealer in antique fishing tackle in Burlington, Vermont, who had records of the reel passing through but had sold it to a private collector whose contact information he was not at liberty to share. It was the one thing she had not been able to recover. She thought about that sometimes, the calculation in the pawn shop parking lot, the reel against the gas. She did not regret the calculation. The calculation had been correct, the only correct calculation available in that moment. But she thought about it. She climbed the stairs. She went up the attic stair, which was now a proper pull-down with a solid handrail and treads that took her weight without comment, and emerged into the library. The afternoon light came through the dormers in wide bands that lay across the hardwood floor, and the spines of the books on the shelves. Some of them hers, some of them from her father's study in the Greenwich house. The ones she had been able to identify and locate and purchase back before the estate sale had cleared the interior. Several of the history books were there, the dense academic kind with the long footnotes. Some of them still had his pencil underlines in certain passages. She had not yet read all of them. She sat in the reading chair. She opened the backpack she had brought up the stairs, a different backpack from the one she had run through the Wisconsin forest with, but she had kept the habit of carrying one, had found it useful, and had not stopped. She reached inside and took out the journal. Edward Wyatt's journal, black leather, its pages dense with the handwriting. She knew better than any other mark in the world had been returned to her by the Federal Evidence Management Office 6 weeks after the conviction, delivered in a padded envelope with a chain of custody form attached documenting every person who had handled it and every time it had been opened. She had held the envelope for a long time before she opened it. She had read portions of the journal during the proceeding, the sections that the legal team needed her familiar with, the sections directly relevant to the charges and the evidence. She had not read it in its entirety. She had been waiting for the right time and place for something she could not have defined precisely, but that she recognized when she arrived at it. She opened it now. The early entries were from more than a year before his death. They were the entries of a man managing a complicated life with the focused, organized intelligence that had built that life in the first place. Business entries about personnel and strategy, and a technical question in the company's software architecture he had been thinking about for months. Entries about the company's culture and the specific people who sustained it. Entries about his health. The cardiac condition written about with the clarity of someone who has faced an unwelcome fact and chosen to understand it fully rather than partially, because partial understanding is not actually less frightening and does not serve any practical purpose. Entries about Sadie. Observations about small things she had said or done that had struck him moments she did not remember and would not have thought he had noticed. A conversation in the kitchen about a book. A question she had asked at dinner about how he had made a particular business decision. The way she had fixed the Civic's brake pads herself rather than taking it to a shop. Not because she could not afford the shop, but because she wanted to understand the mechanism. He had written, "She approaches things the way I hope I taught her to, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Start with how it works, then decide what to do with it." She read this slowly, then the entries changed. Approximately 11 months before his death, the tone shifted in a way that was subtle at first and then unmistakable. An entry about a conversation with Diana that had left him unsettled in ways he could not immediately name. Subsequent entries about the quality of his own thinking, the fogginess, the sense of being slightly removed from his own cognition in ways that the medication had produced before, but that felt different now, more pronounced, less attributable to documented side effects. An entry about the decision to skip a dose and the specific quality of the clarity that returned. He wrote in that entry, "I am beginning to understand something I do not want to understand. I am going to take some time to be certain before I commit it to paper. I know what it looks like when I am being managed. I know because I have managed difficult situations myself for decades, and I know what the management looks like from the inside. I am being managed. The question is toward what end and by whom, and I believe I already know the answers to both." She read the following pages, the weeks of careful documentation that followed his decision to seek certainty before recording his conclusions, the blood draw in the Swiss laboratory, and the report that confirmed what he had suspected. The entries became more compressed after that, shorter and more urgent, the handwriting under pressure. He wrote about the property in Wisconsin, about the bank box, about the false bottom in the tackle box, all of it described in terms of the decisions he was making and why. He wrote about Sadie. He wrote about what he hoped for her. He wrote about the specific quality he had always most admired in her, the thing he had meant by the word compass, and he returned to it multiple times in the final weeks, the way people return to the things that matter most when time is narrowing. The entries from the final week were very short. The handwriting was effortful, the pen pressed hard into the paper to compensate for diminishing control. The last entry was dated 4 days before he died. It was 3 paragraphs. The first was about the company, a final note on a personnel question. He had been considering a recommendation written as if he expected it to be implemented, which was the only way he could approach any practical matter, with the assumption that the work would be done, and the question was only how to do it well. The second was about the house in Wisconsin and about her. He wrote, "I don't know if you found it. There were too many variables for certainty about that. But I know you looked. I know that because I know you, because I have watched you your whole life, and looking is what you do. You have never stood in front of an unclear thing and decided not to try to understand it. Even when the thing was unpleasant or difficult or not what you expected to find, you looked. That is not nothing. That is almost everything." He wrote, "You have always been more stubborn than is comfortable to be around, and I have always been grateful for it than I knew how to say. You got it from me. I got it from your grandmother, who got it from someone before her. It is a family trait that has worn out its welcome in almost every room it has ever entered, and I have never once wished we didn't have it. The third paragraph was a single sentence. If you are reading this in the light, Sadie, it means you found your way home, and you were always my compass, and I am more proud of you than this page, or any page that has ever been made, is large enough to hold. She read it once. She closed the journal. She pressed it against her chest with both hands, the spine against her sternum, the leather cover warm from the afternoon light coming through the dormer window and lying across the chair and her hands in the room. She sat like that for a long time. Outside the dormers, the forest held the light until it didn't, the green of the tree line going deeper and then softer as the sun dropped behind the western tree line, the shadows extending and then dissolving into the general dusk. The clearing went from gold to gray. The oak tree at the eastern corner became a silhouette, and then simply a darkness against the lighter darkness of the sky. She did not cry. She did not have adequate words for what she felt, which was not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something more layered and more complex and ultimately more livable than grief. Something that contained grief alongside gratitude and the particular form of love that survives its object and becomes over time a different thing, not less. Different, quieter, less immediate. More durable in the way that things become durable when they are no longer dependent on presence to sustain them. She stood. She went to the nearest shelf and placed the journal between two of his history books, the large, dense ones with the long footnotes. It fit there the way things fit into spaces that were made for them. She stood with her hand on the spine for a moment. Then she went to the dormer window and looked out. The clearing below was in the blue-gray light of early night. The oak tree was still. The logging road disappeared into the forest, and the forest closed behind it completely, so that from this angle there was no evidence that any road existed, only the clearing and the trees and the sky above them, which was darkening through its spectrum of closing colors toward full dark. She knew there was a road out there. She had run it once in the rain and the dark with a damaged ankle, and people behind her who intended to stop her and did not succeed. She had found the county highway on the other side. She had found a truck and a driver who asked no questions, and a federal building and an agent who listened, and a legal process that slowly and imperfectly, and with the grinding friction of all institutional processes, had done the thing it was built to do. She had looked up. She had found what was there. She had carried it out of the dark and into the light. She looked up at the sky above the clearing. It was the color of the narrow interval between day and full dark, that brief window when both are present simultaneously, and the sky holds a shade that has no precise name in any language, but that anyone who has seen it knows immediately and does not forget. She had spent 19 years in a house built over something she could not see. She had been sent out of it with a trash bag and a green metal box, and the accumulated weight of a childhood spent with a man who had been preparing her for this without her knowing she was being prepared, because the preparation was simply the life he had chosen to live with her. She had looked up. She had found what was there. She had brought it back into the light. The first star appeared above the tree line, then another, and then a third close by the second, and then the rest of the sky began to fill in, the way it fills in when there is no competing light. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the Milky Way becoming visible as the faint smear of light she had seen on the night she first arrived. Standing in the clearing below with a phone flashlight and a brass key, and a sense that everything she had held on to was about to either break completely or hold in ways she hadn't yet understood. It had held. She stayed at the window until the clearing was fully dark and the stars were fully present, and the forest had become the specific, indeterminate presence of forests at night, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply there as it had been before she arrived and would be after she left, and would be for a long time after that. Then she turned back to the room, to the shelves of books and the warm hardwood and the last amber light coming from the reading lamp beside the chair. She went down the attic stairs and through the bedroom and down the main staircase and through the living room where the green tackle box sat on the mantel above the stone fireplace. She opened the damper and laid kindling in the firebox and then two splits of the dry oak the contractor had stacked on the porch. And she struck a match and lit the kindling and watched the small fire find its shape and grow into something steady. And she sat in the chair facing the fireplace in the warm light of the fire and looked at the green metal box on the mantel and thought about her father. She thought about what he had built, not the company, though the company was real and considerable. But the other thing, the one that had no formal name or legal structure or line on any financial document, the architecture of his trust in her, the system of connected decisions he had made across more than a year of fear and determination and failing health, each one pointing to the next. Each one resting on his knowledge of who she was and how she thought and what she would do when she understood what was being asked of her. He had trusted her to look up. She had looked up. She had found everything he had left for her to find. The fire settled into itself with the sound of wood adjusting to heat, the small percussions of a living thing doing what it was made to do. The room was warm. Outside, the Wisconsin night was doing what Wisconsin nights do in early June, which is to be enormous and star-filled, and entirely indifferent to everything happening within it, a quality that is in its way a comfort. She sat with the fire and the tackle box and the warmth and the indifferent stars and the particular love that survives its object, and she sat there for a very long time.